Okay, so get this. We're diving into David Koresh today, the leader of the Branch Davidians.
Oh, yeah, Koresh.
Yeah, I mean, decades later, and people are still arguing about him.
It's wild, right?
Was he like a real visionary or just like crazy good at manipulating people?
Yeah. Was he gifted or was he a grifter?
Exactly the question we're always asking here, right?
Right. And to get to the bottom of that with Koresh, I think you got to go deeper than just Waco, you know?
Yeah, beyond the headlines.
Exactly. Back to the beginning, his whole story, the tough childhood, then becoming the leader of the Branch Davidians. I think there are clues everywhere.
We've got a ton of stuff to go through for this one. Wikipedia, old news articles from the siege, even some more recent stuff. It's crazy how much debate this one guy still causes.
It is.
So where do we even start?
I think you got to start with the early years. Vernon Howell before he became David Koresh. That's important.
Right before the name change.
Yeah, he had a rough start, born to a teenager in Houston. Single mom, spent most of his childhood with his grandmother.
Yeah, and from what I read, it sounds like a pretty lonely childhood, right?
Yeah.
Struggling in school, didn't really fit in. But here's the thing that always gets me. He was amazing at memorizing scripture.
Oh, yeah.
Even as a teenager, he
Yeah.
could quote huge sections of the Bible like word for word.
Exactly. That's key. That's a really important detail, I think, because it kind of points to a few things that become super important later on, like his charisma, his ability to persuade people, and maybe even this desire for control that comes with knowing something others don't.
Hmm, that's interesting.
And it's also worth noting he was really good at music and carpentry, things that take real focus and dedication.
Wait, music? I
Mm.
had no idea.
Yeah.
I thought this was like a fire and brimstone preacher type.
Mm.
He actually dropped out of high school to try and become a rock star in L.A.
Yeah,
I read he was into bands like Ted Nugent and Megadeth.
that's right.
That's kind of surprising for a future religious leader, don't you think?
It is fascinating, right? And it's a detail that often gets missed. Think about it. Rock music, especially back then, it was all about rebellion, pushing boundaries, grabbing the audience's attention.
Yeah.
So you have to wonder, could those elements, even subconsciously, have affected how he led later on,
Yeah, it makes you wonder if there's a connection there.
Definitely something to think about.
So the rock star thing didn't work out. He ends up back in Texas, joins the Branch Davidians, a Seventh-day Adventist splinter group known for some pretty intense beliefs about the end of the world.
Yeah.
What drew him to this specific group?
Well, the Branch Davidians were all about apocalyptic prophecies. They believed they were living in the last days before this huge battle between good and evil.
Right, the end times.
Exactly. And Koresh, with his already deep Bible knowledge and his, growing charisma, he quickly became influential in the group.
But it wasn't exactly a peaceful rise to power, was it?
No.
I mean, there were power struggles, accusations of abuse, and even a shootout with the previous leader's son, George Roden. Seems like conflict followed Koresh everywhere.
You're right. This wasn't just some quiet theological disagreement. In 1987, Koresh and his followers, they went to the Mount Carmel compound where the Branch Davidians lived and got into a gunfight with Roden.
Whoa.
Yeah. It all started because they were trying to photograph Roden digging up a corpse.
What?
Roden thought he could resurrect the dead and was challenging Koresh for leadership.
Hold on, digging up a corpse.
Yeah.
Things were already pretty intense before Waco even happened.
Oh, absolutely. This incident shows Koresh wasn't afraid to use violence to get his way,
Yeah.
Although he was charged with attempted murder, it ended in a mistrial, and Roden ended up in prison for something else completely.
Huh.
So this cleared the way for Koresh to take over.
Okay.
And just a few years later, in 1990, Vernon Howell officially became David Koresh.
And that name change is pretty significant, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
It's like he's intentionally connecting himself to the biblical King David,
Exactly.
a powerful and often ruthless leader.
Koresh was creating an image, a messianic image that his followers really responded to.
Yeah?
His teachings became more and more focused on the book of Revelations, and he presented himself as a key figure in the coming apocalypse.
So was he a true believer, or was this a calculated power play?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It's hard to say for sure, and that's what makes his whole story so fascinating.
It is.
So we've got Koresh now in control of the Branch Davidians, living at Mount Carmel, stockpiling weapons and preaching that the end is near.
Yeah.
What was life actually like inside the compound before things escalated with the ATF and the FBI?
Well, so life at Mount Carmel, it wasn't all doom and gloom,
I mean, they were preparing for the end of the world, right?
Yeah, but it was also a community. They built a whole life there.
Really?
A chapel, a gym, even a swimming pool.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Koresh even had his followers working on repairing and selling weapons.
Weapons. So much for turning the other cheek.
Well, it was all part of his apocalyptic vision, preparing for the final battle.
I guess so, but it also raises some red flags, right?
Definitely,
Yeah.
that there were accusations of child abuse and Koresh taking multiple wives.
Multiple wives.
Yeah, and not just that he demanded celibacy from the men while taking women as his own wives.
That's messed up,
Yeah, it was a pretty twisted interpretation of religious doctrine.
to say the least. So we have this community preparing for the end of the world, stockpiling weapons, and with Koresh at the center of it all, controlling every aspect of their lives.
Right, and it's important to understand how he was able to maintain this level of control. The psychology of cults, the dynamics between leaders and followers.
Yeah, I mean, how does someone like Koresh gain so much influence?
Well, it's a complex process, but there are some common threads.
Like what?
Cult leaders, they often have this undeniable charisma. They weave a narrative that taps into people's fears and desires, and they promise a sense of belonging or special knowledge. They target people who are feeling vulnerable or disillusioned with mainstream society.
So Koresh definitely had that charisma we talked about, his rock star past, and his ability to captivate people with scripture.
Yeah.
And his apocalyptic teachings, they played right into people's anxieties about the future.
Exactly. And imagine believing you have the inside scoop on the end of the world.
Wow.
Koresh positioned himself as the only one who could interpret these prophecies, the only guide to salvation.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful.
Right. It's a strong draw for people seeking meaning and security in a world that feels chaotic and uncertain.
And a lot of Koresh's followers came from troubled backgrounds or felt like outsiders, right?
Absolutely. They were searching for something to believe in a community where they felt accepted.
So Koresh gave them that.
A sense of purpose, a feeling of being part of something bigger than themselves. He created this tight-knit community at Mount Carmel, a refuge from the perceived evils of the outside world.
But that refuge came at a high price, right?
Yeah, there were strict rules, isolation from the outside world, and increasingly disturbing allegations of abuse.
Like we talked about the multiple wives, including underage girls.
Right, and the forced celibacy for the men, while Koresh took women as his own wives.
It's hard to see that as anything other than abuse of power.
And that's where the whole grifter versus gifted debate comes in.
Yeah.
Some former Branch Davidians say he was a loving and caring leader, but others describe a much darker reality: manipulation, coercion, a system designed to keep followers dependent and obedient.
It's chilling to think about, especially knowing how it all ended with the Waco siege.
Right.
That botched ATF raid, the 51-day standoff, the FBI psychological tactics.
Yeah.
It all created this pressure cooker that exploded in tragedy.
Yeah, the siege was the culmination of all the tension surrounding Koresh and the Branch Davidians.
Definitely.
It became the symbol of resistance for some and a chilling example of government overreach for others.
And for the people inside that compound, it was the ultimate test of their faith and loyalty to Koresh.
And as we know, it ended in a devastating fire, the deaths of 76 people, including 25 children.
A horrific outcome.
The Waco siege really forced the world to confront these uncomfortable questions about religious extremism, the limits of individual freedom, and the dangers of unchecked power.
And it all comes back to that central question: was Koresh a true believer who thought he was saving his followers, or was he a manipulator who used their faith to control and exploit them?
It's not an easy question to answer.
No, and that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. It's not always clear-cut.
Yeah.
The line between genuine belief and calculated manipulation can be blurry, especially in a situation like this.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the nuances, looking at all the evidence, and ultimately coming to your own conclusions about David Koresh, the leader, and the legacy he left behind.
Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of ground here about Koresh's life and his leadership of the Branch Davidians. But to really understand this story, I think we need to go deeper into the Waco siege itself.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here about Koresh's life and his leadership of the Branch Davidians. But to really understand this story, I think we need to go deeper into the Waco siege itself.
Yeah, it's the event that defines him in most people's minds, even now, all these years later.
It's hard to believe it all started with a botched raid.
Right, February 28th, 1993.
Yeah, the ATF, they thought the Branch Davidians were stockpiling illegal weapons, so they tried to raid the Mount Carmel compound.
But it went so wrong.
Yeah, it turned into a deadly shootout almost immediately.
4 ATF agents were killed, 6 Branch Davidians too.
And that's when the siege really began.
51 days the world watched.
It's crazy to think about that the Branch Davidians holed up in the compound, led by Koresh, surrounded by federal agents.
And there were moments it seemed like it might end peacefully,
Yeah, Koresh did release some of his followers, some of the children, too.
Right. But many stayed inside, totally committed to Koresh and his prophecies.
It makes you wonder what was going through their minds during those 51 days.
Well, it shows how much they trusted him, how devoted they were.
Yeah, they believed he was a prophet, that he could save them.
They were willing to die with him.
It's hard to wrap your head around that level of belief.
It really speaks to the power of a charismatic leader, how they can influence people's perceptions, even when they're in danger.
And as the siege went on, the FBI started using these pretty intense tactics.
Yeah, psychological warfare, some people called it.
Loud music, bright lights, sleep deprivation. They were trying to wear down the Branch Davidians and force Koresh to surrender.
It was controversial even at the time.
Yeah, some argued that those tactics just made things worse.
Right, pushed the Branch Davidians further into their beliefs, made them even more distrustful of the authorities.
And then April 19th, 1993, it all ended in that horrific fire.
A tragedy no matter what.
After weeks of negotiations and pressure from everyone, the Attorney General Janet Reno, she authorized the FBI to use tear gas to try and get the Branch Davidians out.
But it backfired.
Shortly after the tear gas, a fire started inside the compound, and it spread so fast.
Engulfed the whole place.
76 people died, including 25 children.
Just awful.
And to this day, there's still debate about what caused the fire.
The government always said the Branch Davidians set it intentionally.
But others believe the FBI's actions, especially the tear gas, contributed to it.
We may never know for sure.
But the fire and the loss of life, it really overshadows everything else about Waco.
Yeah, it raised questions about the government's handling of the situation, the limits of religious freedom, and the dangers of escalating these kinds of standoffs.
The aftermath of Waco was intense.
Congressional hearings, investigations, endless debates about what went wrong and who was to blame.
And Waco still resonates today.
Oh, yeah. For some, it's a rallying cry against the government, a symbol of government overreach and the threat to individual liberty.
And it all circles back to David Koresh. Was he a visionary or a con man?
A gifted leader or a grifter?
We've explored his whole life, the good, the bad, the complicated, the tragic.
It's up to each of us to decide what we believe.
It's a question that continues to fascinate and divide us.
Yeah. David Koresh's story, it stays with you long after the flames died down at Mount Carmel.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into one of the most controversial and impactful events in recent history.